Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the invitation. And hi, everyone. I won't say time zone because I think a lot of people are on different time zones. So today I'm basically going to give an overview of two case studies, one from the tropical savanna of Northern Australia, and the other one a bit closer to my home in Brisbane, which is literally just across the bay. And again, looking at sort of indicators for human impact and also human cultural change as well. Okay, so I'm actually going to do my acknowledgements first. Now, both of these case studies have been strongly linked with traditional owners in Australia. So the first case study, which is sort of focused in Northern Tropical Australia, is close collaboration with the Kaita Aboriginal Corporation. Also working with Sean Olm at James Cook University and Craig Sloss at QUT, and a range of students are involved, including Lydia McKenzie, who I think I see is one of the people involved in the workshop. And the other case study, which is more ongoing work, is with the Quandamooka people, but also involving John Tibby and Cameron Barr, in particular from the University of Adelaide, and colleagues at the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, so John Marshall and Glenn McGregor in particular, and as well as a range of students who will hopefully remember to mention as well. All right, so basically I'm going to give you an overview of a completed study, which is looking at the impacts of people in late Holocene times in Bentinck Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria in Northern Australia. And why this is really important is that it helps to link historical, paleoecological, archaeological, and traditional knowledge in understanding the environment, but also in terms of what happens to a landscape when people leave and then return. And it gives us a little sort of case study to these processes. The other case study is focusing on more ongoing work. So very much work that's been going on since about 2004, but progressing. And this is looking at late Quaternary environments in Minjerribah, which is the Quandamooka name of North Stradbroke Island in subtropical Eastern Australia. And this is really working what in Australia we call on country. So this is working closely with traditional landholders to understand their history. And I think that's a really important aspect of working in Australia now in terms of providing that information for our Indigenous people within Australia. All right, so first case study is the South Wesley Islands, or Wellesley Islands. So I'm primarily going to focus on Bentinck Island, which is the largest island group, or part of the island group here. And there are a number of really important sites that are both archaeological and paleoecological. So we can start to combine those two data sets. The region is dominated by savanna, so generally you've got forest with a grassy understory, which is also fairly common across large parts of Northern Australia as well. There's also a really interesting linguistic history that's been developed for the area. So the Kaidot people basically occupy the South Wellesley Islands. We have the Lardell occupied sort of Mornington Island, which is a sort of bigger island to the north. We have the Unkul, sort of close to the mainland and some of the islands here. And then the Gangelida, which is sort of the mainland group as well. But basically a history or record of occupation has been developed from changes in the language groups, which I think is another really important aspect of examining human impacts and trying to tie the paleoecology and ecology and archaeology into that. So why is Bentinck so interesting? Well, firstly, it's one of the last areas settled by Europeans or colonized by Europeans, but there's actually a relatively long historical record. So we actually have Flinders visited this site at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, but generally it wasn't settled until the late 19th to the mid 20th century. The Kaidot people were actually one of the last Indigenous groups to maintain a traditional lifestyle on Bentinck Island. They were forcibly removed from the island in 1948, and this was as a consequence of a cyclone that struck the island, caused a famine and basically destroyed the freshwater resources. So there was a 3.7 metre tidal surge, which basically impacted all the freshwater systems. So they were basically transferred from Bentinck Island to Mornington Island in a mission area. Now, interestingly enough, they were granted native title a bit earlier than a lot of groups across Australia in the 1980s. And now they've actually returned to the island and interacting with the island. So we basically have a sort of 50-year depopulation event. And really interesting to see if we can pick that up in the paleoecological record and see what the landscape response is. Secondly, sort of longer timescales, when did the island become suitable for Cardinal to arrive in the late Holocene? So we have some answers to these questions, but still a bit more work to go. So during the Pleistocene with lower sea levels, the area around Gulf of Carpentaria, which would have been dry land and the suggestion of a large lake system, would have been most likely occupied by people. Rising sea levels probably impacted this occupation and allowed occupation of the Bentinck Island up until 5,500 years ago. And a lot of this evidence is, as I said, based on linguistic analysis of changes in language groups. The islands, the South Wellesley archipelago, were abandoned between 5,500 to 1,000 years ago. And this is probably related to high sea levels, so impacting freshwater resources. And so a fall in sea levels basically allowed the island to be more favourable to recolonisation. And we have archaeological evidence of this being recolonised about over the last 1,000 years. One of the other interesting aspects of it, there's also contact with the Kayardild people and Macassan traders from Sulawesi that also occurred over this period. And this is marked by the presence of a tamarind tree on one of the smaller islands, Fowler Island, on the archipelago as well. So, you know, there's some other interesting bits that sort of emerge from this. So the key site I'm going to talk about is Miralda Wetland. Now, this is sort of preliminary work that I was involved with, and Lydia Mackenzie's actually done a lot more work on this and probably suggests a more nuanced and complex story than what I'm going to present as well. But happy to for Lydia to sort of add some additional information as we move to the workshop side of things. But this is the site we sort of focused on initially. So a freshwater system dominated by sedges and rushes. You can see some paperbark trees in the distance. This is the tamarind tree at Fowler Island, so that evidence, and there's actually pottery that's been found here as well. And there's also Kayardild dreaming stories and dreaming places located here that mark the presence of the Macassan traders. Here's another site, a Midden site located close to Miralda. And probably the key Kayardild impact on the landscape, broader landscape, which is the use of fire. So this was a fire that was started by one of the elders on the island while we were doing field work. So we took several cores across the Miralda wetland. So it's a large area, which is basically freshwater system. So we're interested in the history of that as well. This is a pollen diagram I produced. There's the paper there. So it goes back about 2,400 years. This section here is basically coastal sediments, marine sediments, low pollen counts, very minimal charcoal, but a landscape from the pollen that we have there that reflects that savanna environment. So lots of grass, some pandanus, and some metaceae, basically. We then see a transition about 500 years ago where we've got mangrove muds coming in, and we see evidence of the mangrove forest. It's a slight increase in burning, which might be reflecting the regional burning by the Kayardild people, but still that sort of savanna characteristic. We had two modern radiocarbon dates, which roughly mark that sort of 1950s. So around that time period of people being removed from the island. And what we see is quite interesting is we see an increase in pandanus pollen and an increase in burning. So we're actually seeing probably a change in fuel loads as a response to that removal of indigenous fire management practices. And then when we come to the sort of top 15 centimeters, we see the return of the sort of lower intensity burning, decline in the pandanus, and a sort of response to that landscape with people coming back into this environment, which is quite interesting. So it does sort of start to give us some insight to those processes. The other part of the project that I focused on was actually looking at the pollen from a Midden site. So not a lot of work's been undertaken in this area. I think there's been a bit of work in Denmark, but it actually provides a viable way to reconstruct past landscapes that can be directly associated with the archaeology. So this is the Midden here. So you're basically seeing going darker from the sort of red soil that's characteristic of the island. We also have a paleo swamp located quite close to the site that Lydia worked on as well. But it provides an interesting counterpoint, I guess, to the sort of regional signals that we see from the pollen records, from the sort of traditional paleoecological pollen records. First thing to note is we have evidence of occupation for 800 years, and the actual process of people bringing the shellfish into this site actually created an environment that was suitable for pollen preservation, which I thought was quite interesting. So it actually altered the soil chemistry that allowed us to reconstruct the environment. Again, we have those typical signals of savanna, so lots of grass, casuarina and myrtaceae, but a couple of other things sort of popped up. So I had a lot of ficus. So you see this ficus pollen here, sandpaper fig, and sort of went into the literature to sort of understand that. And there's actually evidence that Indigenous people were using that and planting that around their campsites as a shade tree. So again, it suggests that we can start to pick up some more nuanced impact on the environment from these archaeological deposits directly. Now, there is also potential to extend this to longer timescales, and this is what we're starting to undertake in Midden and Australasia Island. So I'll bring in the subtropical story now. And this is very much our current research on Midden, or the Quandamooka name for Australasia Island. Now, there's been a lot of focus on the paleoecological sites, and particularly lake sites, and we have 7 sites that extend to the last glacial maximum and beyond. 2 of the sites actually reach, one site reaches 208,000, another site about 130,000. But a lot of interesting sites that gives us that sort of deep time perspective. But we also have Pleistocene archaeological deposits, which we can directly relate to these paleoecological sites. The other aspect that I want to sort of highlight is that the Quandamooka people are actually driving this research. So we've got an excavation planned on the island over the July-August period, and that's very much being driven by the Quandamooka people in terms of reconstructing and providing information on their history. And I think this is a really important aspect of research in Australia generally, of involving traditional Indigenous landholders in this research as well. And I'm going to sort of give you a brief overview of using iTrax XRF analysis to sort of improve our proxy analysis data sets. So there's multiple lakes on the island, a combination of perched lake systems and groundwater fed systems. 7 sites, as I said, at least 7 sites extend older than 20,000. John Tibby sort of provided an overview of that in a JQS paper, which if people are interested can go have a look at. One of the key sites that we're actually focusing on at the moment is Coompi Swamp. And the reason for that is that's situated very close to the Wallen archaeological site. And I've got a PhD student, Jody Schultz, who's currently looking at both sites as well. As I mentioned, we've got Pleistocene archaeology. Now, the Pleistocene archaeology is actually was found in the 1980s from a Neal and Stock paper. We've recently gone back and actually obtained the original samples and redated the samples. The ages here were primarily from radiocarbon dating, and there was a lot of controversy associated with them, but we've actually redated them both with radiocarbon and OSL and confirmed these ages. So this site has at least a 27,000 year history of occupation, and it looks to be fairly continuous. One of the interesting things is this shift around about 5,000 years ago to utilizing shellfish as the system became marine system from a terrestrial system. This also provides the opportunity to reconstruct the pollen record. So Jody's also looking at that. and has also reported to me that she's found evidence of the umbrella tree, evidence of European colonization in there as well. But yeah, it's a lot of potential both to look at the site itself, but also compare with a closely related paleoecological site. One of the other aspects that we're also looking at is wire rush or empedema minus marsh systems. So most of the lakes have been looked at on the island, but our sort of marsh systems, peatland systems still have got a lot of potential. This is a site actually located in one of the major urban settings on the island, Dunwich, Jumping Grass Swamp, which is actually right next door to the kayak quantum offices, which is quite convenient. But we've also got aerial photographs that we can use and a really good peat record that we can look at as well. One thing to caution though is you've got to be really careful before you get ages of sediment records. So I had an honours student working on this site, Penelope Webster. We didn't have dates when she wrote her honours project, so we basically assumed that the higher macro charcoal peats here was the sort of pre-indigenous, or sorry, the indigenous period, the pre-colonial period, and post that was the sort of the colonial period. But obviously we were out by several orders of magnitude there as well. So the key change here in the charcoal actually seems to be a change from a terrestrial to marine system, basically influencing those charcoal peaks as well. And we've got XRF data from this and a pollen record, which I won't go into too much detail at the moment, but it's providing some really interesting information at this site. What I thought I'd finish off on is some other work that's been undertaken by a honours student or master's coursework student, Sarah Hall, who is focusing on macro charcoal from another site called 18 Mile Swamp, which provides a really high resolution record. So basically this goes back about 500 years. It's a two meter sedimentary record. So we're getting down to sort of almost 2-year resolution with the macro charcoal record, 2 to 3 years. We see an interesting change at 1819 AD, about 200 years ago, in the charcoal, which reflects European colonization. The core's also undergone XRF analysis. And one thing I just want to point out is this really interesting change in zirconium, much higher here in the indigenous period and sort of dropping off. And what I think that reflects is actually a more open landscape. Now, I haven't completed the pollen record yet, but there's actually much higher grass here. And I suspect we're going to see an increase in shrubs in the understory here impacting there. There's also seems to be some correlation with the iron titanium ratio and the iron ratio and burning regimes. And some other interesting things we can sort of pick up is this increase in lead, which basically reflects the introduction of leaded petrol in Australia. So these are some other proxies that we can start to use to sort of understand some of the processes. So you can also use things like copper, zinc, to sort of get some idea of smelting and other processes from the XRF analysis, which is really interesting and provides a wealth of additional data. But again, that's very much work in progress at the moment. And I think I'll leave it there. And if people have got any questions, happy to answer them.
Thanks, Patrick. Wonderful stuff. I've got a question, if I can. The Wallen site, you redated the archaeological materials, confirm those ages with new radiocarbon and OSL. So you've got occupation going back 27,000 years. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
But your charcoal record really only kicks up much later in the sequence. Why is that, do you think?
Again, I'm not sure. It could be the intensification hypothesis. There's some interesting things up the top there, and so maybe more people. And also wondering whether the fact that it's become an island that's concentrating people. So prior to that, people could sort of spread more across the landscape, where with the rise in sea level development of Moreton Bay, it's sort of pushing people and would have actually had a dramatic impact there as well. Now, the data set for Wallen's from the original Neil and Stock one. So we're actually redoing the analysis of that. So more information might come out. The archaeological group at UQ have actually re-excavated the site, so they've actually got new material. Doing an archaeological excavation in sand is extremely dangerous, particularly if you're going 3 meters out. So there's actually a another site, Canalpin Creek, that they're going to look at, which could be potentially Pleistocene as well. And there is a suggestion from Wallen that we could have artifacts going back 40,000. So, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. That's very much probably keep under your hat at the moment. But basically, it's looking like an old landscape, and we're starting to get the archaeology with it as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I'm interested in charcoal as a proxy for people in places like, well, all around the world, really. But in Australia, it's heavily relied upon as a proxy for people, as you know very well, going back, glacial cycles kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a classic example, right? What you're seeing in the charcoal record might be a broad kind of mid-Holocene intensification, which is a hypothesis we've had in Australia for ages. Or it might be, rising sea level concentrating people in an island, in which case the kind of ability for us to make any overarching framework or interpretive context for changes in charcoal in the late Holocene, pretty much impossible, because there's so much local variety, and the larger the scale, the more difference you'll see due to local site processes and nothing else. It's really quite fascinating.
I mean, I think Minjerribah, Australia, actually offers the potential to sort of resolve some of those issues. So I've got 3 of the records, but there's multiple records out there as well. So one record I could give you the classic Lynch's crater story. So basically burning at 40,000 and pretty much, the potential human impact. 5 kilometers away, I can give you the impacts of the last glacial maximum. And then another one, I can give you another 5 kilometers away, give you the indicators, maybe a younger dryas or Antarctic cold reversal charcoal peak. So again, it's a site that's really got me sort of thinking about, how we apply charcoal. And I think we need to have multiple sites. And that's one of the massive advantages of having a lot of paleo sites, a lot of archaeology close together, that you can start to tie them together and start to get the nuances there. And I think, as I said, with the Benthic Island study, Lydia can probably go on and give a much more nuanced story than one I've given as well.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, just briefly, if anybody else has any questions at this point, you're welcome to take the floor.